I'm Charlene Son Rigby, the CEO of Global Genes. I'm also a rare disease parent, mom to Juno, who just turned 11. And I'm really excited to have the privilege of welcoming you to our Rare Advocacy Summit. Welcome to Kansas City. It's hard to hear the word Kansas without thinking of the Wizard of Oz and Dorothy, who is transported to an unknown land and sets out on a journey to find her way home. Arm in arm with friends, she makes along the way. What a wonderful image for our goal that we've been pursuing for over a dozen years with this summit. It's the reason that we come here, not to just learn and be inspired, but to discover the path forward together. This theme for this year's conference is There's No Place Like Hope. And for those of us who are dedicated to the rare disease community, we know better than anyone else that hope is a muscle. There's no magic that's going to get us where we need to go. Clicking our heels isn't going to take us home. And it's those other C's that we need to give us the power to reach our goals. Those C's are community, compassion, and collaboration. The deeper truth is that everyone in this room and on the live stream has something really important to contribute. You belong here. And whether you're here for the first time, as I was in 2017, still reeling from a diagnosis, or you've been relentlessly working to make life better for people with rare disease for 30 years or more, whether you're someone living with a rare disease or who cares passionately about people who are impacted, whether you're a researcher, a clinician, an advocacy leader, patient, parent, or volunteer, you belong here. It will take all of our voices, our brains, our heart, and courage to get us there, and we will get there. Our keynote speaker today, John Crowley, is someone who has served the rare community in all of these roles and has shown us what's possible. John is the father of 3 children, 2 of whom were born with a rare genetic condition called Pompe disease. His quest to save the lives of his children led him to co-found a biotech that was acquired by Genzyme Therapeutics. He continued to play a key role in development of that therapy as senior vice president. He then served more than 15 years as the founder and CEO of Amicus, and recently was named the CEO of Bio, the world's largest biotechnology organization. The story of his quest to save his children was the subject of a film called Extraordinary Measures. And I think there may be no better way to get introduced to John's journey than to watch this clip.
And both kids, it's the heart that's the real threat to their lives.
How much more time do we have?
I wish that we had a drug to treat Pompe, but we simply don't. I'm sorry.
Dr. Stonehill.
Yeah.
This is John Crowley. All the researchers say that you're a genius on the verge of a scientific breakthrough.
I'm not on the verge of anything.
How much would it take to prove your theory? I promised him that we'd raise 500,000.
That's all? Is it 500 or 1,000?
500,000.
Are you totally insane?
Apparently.
Figure any dude in a business suit can help me raise venture capital and run the company, but who's going to be half as motivated as a dad who's trying to save his own kids?
Do you have a wife?
Ex-wives. 2 of them.
How come?
Because I'm so easy to get along with.
We can do this. We push ourselves. We work around the clock. I already work around the clock. Great. Cure diseases in theory, but never help a single human being in reality.
I can't cure your kids, you know that, but I think I can save their lives.
You're in clinical trials by the end of the year, or we pull the plug.
Nobody is going to tell me how to run my lab.
We're out of time.
Are you crazy? You've jeopardized your chances of ever getting your kids treated. We are
told me that I should stop chasing miracles.
Well, don't get your hopes up, kid. Say Hail Mary.
Not gonna kiss me, is he?
I will restrain him.
Do you remember you told me
And now I'd like to welcome John to the stage.
Thank you. It is so great to be here in Kansas City this morning among friends. Charlene and I had a chance to visit about what we want to talk about this morning, and we agreed that I'd come up and give some introductory comments, and then Charlene will come back and we'll do a bit of a fireside chat here in the chairs. I did ask Charlene, how long should I speak for when I come up to the podium? And she said, well, why don't you speak for a while, and then we'll sit down and talk. And I don't know about you, but if you tell a rare disease mom or a dad to speak for a while, I am a student of history, and I know that Abraham Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address in less than 2 minutes, and it's widely regarded as one of the greatest speeches in the history of mankind. Julius Caesar spoke for 2 hours, and his friend stabbed him to death. So this will just be a couple of minutes of introductory comments, and it's great to thank you for playing the movie trailer about our family as well. The movie this January will be 15 years since Extraordinary Measures premiered, and for our family it was a very unique experience. For me, growing up in northern New Jersey, the son of a police officer and a waitress, we didn't go to a lot of Hollywood cocktail parties, and Eileen and I, my wife and I, were pretty reluctant to share our story after a series of newspaper articles and a book that was written, but we trusted the producers, and we really tried to use that to share our family as one example of what are countless examples of people living in the world of rare diseases, and to show just how difficult it is to make medicines for these diseases. When we think too about this movie, it was a great experience for our children. My son Patrick is pretty shy. My older son John, who doesn't live with Pompe disease but lives with high-functioning autism, the thought of rolling down the red carpet was just absolutely terrifying. Megan, for those of you who may know Megan, and she was portrayed quite well in the film, Megan actually relished it. And I will tell you, at one point we were at a press conference with the stars of the film, and people were asking us questions about our life and medicine and the disease and all of that. And Megan was sitting there quietly in her wheelchair, and she said, well, actually, I'd like to add something about the movie. Okay. And she said, well, I just want everybody to realize that the movie does contain one of the great exaggerations in the history of Hollywood. Now, I'm getting a little nervous asking us questions about our life and medicine and the disease and all of that. And Megan was sitting there quietly in her wheelchair. She said, it's easy, can't you see? She said, well, actually, I'd like to add something about the movie. An actor who's 6'5" to play my father. I just want everybody to realize that the movie does contain one of the great exaggerations in the history of Hollywood. Now, I'm getting a little nervous asking us questions about our life and medicine and the disease and all of that. And Megan was sitting there quietly in her wheelchair. She said, it's easy, can't you see? Well, actually, I'd like to add something about the movie. An actor who's 6'5" to play my father. I just want everybody to realize that the movie does contain one of the great exaggerations in the history of Hollywood. Now, I'm getting a little nervous asking us questions about our life and medicine and the disease and all of that. And Megan was sitting there quietly in her wheelchair. She said, it's easy, can't you see? Well, actually, I'd like to add something about the movie. An actor who's 6'5" to play my father. I just want everybody to realize that the movie does contain one of the great exaggerations in the history of Hollywood. Now, I'm getting a little nervous asking us questions about our life and medicine and the disease and all of that. And Megan was sitting there quietly in her wheelchair. She said, it's easy, can't you see? Well, actually, I'd like to add something about the movie. An actor who's 6'5" to play my father. I just want everybody to realize that the movie does contain one of the great exaggerations in the history of Hollywood. Now, I'm getting a little nervous asking us questions about our life and medicine and the disease and all of that. And Megan was sitting there quietly in her wheelchair. She said, it's easy, can't you see? Well, actually, I'd like to add something. How do we develop treatment therapy I just want everybody to realize that it can extend beyond our lives. The great exaggeration of loved ones are and even when we develop questions about our life, medicine, disease, all of that, how do we go back to the Megan was sitting there quietly to really hear? It was 8 years ago today, on September 26, 2016, that my daughter Megan received a new enzyme replacement therapy. The original therapy had saved her and everybody in our community realized we needed to do better. And just pressing that infusion button, as we had done 13 years earlier with the first generation therapy, gave us hope. And so to come to this conference and to realize that, yes, there is no place like hope, but it has to be a hope tempered with reality. Last night, I was on the phone with the family, checking in when I got to the hotel and catching up on the day and the requests of the day from the family. My daughter Megan said, "Oh, you're going to be there with Miss Nicole and everybody at Global Genes." I said, "Yeah, I'm excited." She goes, "But I thought you don't make medicines anymore." I said, "Well, I don't. You know, I run our biotechnology innovation organization, our industry group. And Megan's a pretty smart kid. I mean, having graduated 5 years ago from Notre Dame and a master's in social work, and now a social worker with the Make-A-Wish Foundation. And so I described it, I said, just kind of reminded her why I was here. And she just said, we were on FaceTime, she said, "I'm sorry." She said, "Could you just tell me again one more time, what is it that you do now?" I'm 6 months into the job. So I figured if Megan doesn't get it, maybe I'll just give you a little bit of a highlight. So BIO, the Biotech Innovation Organization that I'm now the CEO of for about 6 months, is made up of about 1,000 member companies and organizations. We are the world's leading advocacy and policy organization to advance this entire ecosystem of what's necessary to make newer and better medicines. And we also work in biotechnology and agriculture and environmental technologies. Most of our work is in human health. We're based in Washington, D.C. There are, in virtually every state, in some states, several state biotech associations, which are also incredibly important, working within their states, again, to create the environment where science and medicine can flourish, where entrepreneurship and the American dream can flourish, where this entire virtuous circle of innovation can excel, always with the patient, family member in the center of that. And it starts almost always with a patient or a family in need, with 4 words to it, typically academic researcher. We have a problem of innovation, and that university researcher, oftentimes responding with 4 words, "We have an idea," or maybe "We have a solution." And so going from academic research to the NIH and NIH-funded research, to then taking that technology out to startup companies, or sometimes to larger companies, moving from small company to angel investor to venture capital investor, involving the FDA, contract manufacturers, consultants, bankers, lawyers. So going from eventually going all the way around the circle, and as you go around, the attrition rate is really high, as we know. But if you can go all the way to the top of that circle and go from a need to an idea to an approved therapy or medicine, it's one of the rarest things you can do in human nature, certainly in business. But again, rarely is it that silver bullet cure. Most often it's extending and enhancing life, providing meaningful solutions. But it gives, again, all of us time to go back to the drawing board. Hopefully when we're already, moving through that virtuous circle, to think about what's next, what's better. And so for me, leading BIO, this is an opportunity to help create many, many more ideas and solutions to help turn that hope, that need, into reality, but to also do it with a great sense of urgency, realizing that time is often our greatest enemy. together with these mistakes of nature, and realizing too that we need to do it for everybody in need. Everybody here in the United States, but ultimately everybody in the world, where this is a universal global problem. And so if there's a theme to my talk and sitting down in a few moments with Charlene, it's going to be where we are today. Crossroads. We are at a crossroads. And we're at a time of choosing. We've made great advancements since the Orphan Drug Act. You look at the hundreds of therapies approved now for rare diseases. We're in a much better place than we were. But I have to tell you, having gone to too many funerals of children, too many memorial services of adults, people living with rare diseases, it's not enough. I'm tired of that. I'm tired of having to repeat all the statistics of 7, 8, 10, 12,000 rare diseases, 95% of which don't have cures. We all know the facts, the statistics. So we're at a crossroads, and it's almost a tale of two cities, right? You've got more science that's more exciting than it's ever been. When our Megan and Patrick were diagnosed in 1998, I looked literally around the world. And in that first 2 years, I found 2 researchers who knew anything about the disease in the Netherlands and at Duke University. Eventually found a few others, including a brilliant scientist in Oklahoma City that was the basis of that first company in technology. But fast forward today, now in Pompe, there are 3 approved medicines. Patients have options. Families have hope, more than hope. They have real outcomes, but it's still not enough. But I look in the academic setting, I look at small companies, large companies, there's more than a dozen new technologies and programs in the pipeline for Pompe. We've come a long way, but it's still not enough. We look at the last couple of years and the amount of venture capital going into startup companies is drying up. The access to public companies for research in the diseases that we care about. These companies are really struggling. And yes, you're starting to see really large investment rounds. The average investment round for a new startup this year, venture-backed, is more than $90 million, an A round of $90 million. But the number of companies is in half. And those already out there are struggling, and oftentimes they're cutting the most technically difficult programs, the programs with the smallest commercial or market opportunity, and invariably those are rare diseases. So while we've got great science, medicine, we've got more than hope today, we've got so many challenges that Charlene and I will dig more deeply into. And so what I'd ask each of you to think about is, with that fierce sense of hope and that great sense of urgency, to no longer just be satisfied with where we are or what's in front of us. And there's precedent. You look back in the late 1980s when HIV and AIDS was devastating, and a community said, enough. And they were incredibly vocal and incredibly active and forced legislators, policymakers, the market, regulators, everybody to take risks that were aligned with what they knew the outcome would be with people living with HIV, AIDS. And you look at when that first drug was approved, AZT was a horribly toxic molecule, barely effective, but it was a start. And you look over that next decade or longer at all the HIV medicines, dozens and combinations of drugs that, as we know now, thankfully, have taken HIV, AIDS from being a death sentence to being a long-term chronic manageable condition. That's the type of passion and enthusiasm we need to bring to this. And so I'd ask each of you, and Charlene and I will talk shortly about what we can do to be more active, to be more vocal, to not be satisfied with where we are today and what's in front of us, and to bring this great sense of urgency. And we've got another precedent, COVID. We all realized how the world changed, and we needed to do things differently, take smart risks. We needed vaccines that were safe and effective, but we needed to throw out the old playbook for how they were developed. And what did we do? We stuck to the gold standard of safety and efficacy, but we also brought the mindset of time that urgency that the world can no longer wait. And so great medicines, technologies, that great urgency of time. But we also brought the mindset that these vaccines needed to get to everyone in need, everyone, literally in the world, universal access. So when Charlene and I talk, I'd love to talk more about this virtuous cycle and circle of innovation, where it's flourishing, where it's struggling, what we could do, policies, where your activism and enthusiasm can be brought to bear, and also talk a little bit about access. So with that, there is great hope. When we think about all the politics that are involved and how difficult it is as we look at whether it's the Pediatric Review Voucher Reauthorization, the Orphan Cures Act, whatever it may be, these need to be entirely bipartisan issues. There's no left, there's no right, there's only back or forward. So with that, Charlene, I'm really eager to get into our conversation and welcome you back. Thank you.
Yes. So
Good. Go ahead.
Perfect.
Before the music stops, yeah.
Yes. John, thank you. That was such an amazing and inspirational talk. And I mean, there's so many things that I want to ask you about, but I wanted to start out about, so the theme of our conference is There's No Place Like Hope. And you said hope tempered by reality. And I think for a lot of us who are on this journey, there's this, it's not just reality, the reality is desperation and urgency. And so I wanted to ask you, what did hope mean to you, in your darkest days, and how did that keep you, pushing forward?
Yeah, I think, Shirley, maybe I'll go back to that day of a diagnosis. It was, again, we all remember it. It was a Friday the 13th, long time ago now, 26 and a half years ago, I guess, on that Friday the 13th, when, we knew our Megan at a year wasn't walking, taking her first steps. And so we went from pediatrician to neurologist, from blood test to scan to deep muscle biopsy. And our greatest fear was maybe we'd be told that she couldn't walk. And it was obviously much more serious. He described this Pompe disease that we'd never heard of. It's autosomal recessive. There's no history in our family. And I remember asking the doctor, is it serious? And I mean, literally his hands were trembling with a social worker there. And he said, yes, it's very serious. And he said, she probably wouldn't live to be but a couple of years old. And we had our then 7-day-old son, Patrick, with us at the appointment. And he said, and he needs to be tested too. There's a 1 in 4 chance. So we go home that night, and again, all those emotions you go through. And I remember, Eileen was only 7 days after a C-section, sleeping at night, and I'm on my laptop just trying to find anything about this disease. Google literally didn't even exist then. It was like Netscape Navigator or something. So I'm looking it up, and I saw an academic paper, and I was terrible at science. And Michael appreciate this. I got a 19 on my organic chemistry final at the Naval Academy, 38 with the curve. But I'm looking at all these papers, and there was one out of Duke, and Dr. Y.T. Chen, and it talked about a naturally occurring animal model, a Japanese quail, of all things, that they had developed an enzyme replacement therapy, and after 4 injections, the quail flew again. And I remember I was so excited, because literally a doctor 8-10 hours before it just told us that, our kids are gonna die. And looking at that, I printed the paper out, I read it again, I started highlighting, and I started waking up Eileen, which 7 days after a C-section, and it was never a great idea with an infant. And she's finally said, what are you doing? What are you talking about? And I tried explaining it. I didn't understand most of it myself. But I said, what it means is there's hope. And to us, it was that somewhere there was a researcher who cared and had been working on this. And just to know that there was some idea, some technology that may apply. And then as we found more families and people affected, and that there was a small community, that small, and we were a long way from a medicine then, but that's what gave us some hope.
Yeah. So when we got our diagnosis for my daughter Juno in 2016, I remember that time. We left with 2 papers.
our geneticist said he didn't know anything about STXBP1 and had never diagnosed a kid with STXBP1. And I remember one of the papers was a very, very small natural history study, not a formal natural history study, just a paper about 15 to 20 patients. And I thought, oh my gosh, there are other patients. There are other kids like Juno.
Yes.
And that was the first stepping stone for me, and in that journey of really trying to navigate the despair, then the urgency, and the 12 stages of grief and all of that. So
and that's what, years ago, there were so many of these diseases that were uncharacterized. Juno wouldn't have been diagnosed
at all
when our kids were. And now, particularly in the neurologic diseases, kids, at least when I was growing up, that were put in buckets of, whatever it may be, epilepsy or, global developmental delay, whatever, are now being found more and more to have monogenetic human disorders where there's ideas for therapy intervention. And so many years ago, and not that long ago, 10, 20, 30 years ago, you wanted to give people some small nugget of hope, but oftentimes that was really hard. Now, it's more often the norm. There is hope, there is a community, there are doctors working on it, there are technologies we can try. And so we just need to make sure that we're trying everything and we're getting it to everyone, and we're doing it as absolutely fast as we can.
Yeah, and enabling people to get to a diagnosis. So you mentioned community, you mentioned meeting the families, and as you started to learn more, and obviously 26 years ago was really different than it is now with the way that social media can really accelerate that process. But
I'm getting old. When I tell my kids Google didn't exist back then, so I get there's some days, some weeks I don't buy green bananas anymore.
Oh, well, I think that you and I are similar in age, and so yes, I remember the Netscape days and all of that. I got my first email address after college, so yes.
I got mine long after college.
Well, I'm curious about, as you started to get to know the community, how did you start to, engage and work with other families, with patients, and how did those relationships grow over time?
For us, we wanted to do everything we could for our kids, of course, and as we got to meet other families, for them as well. It was hard in Pompe. It was a pretty disjointed community way back then, and there was a lot of challenge and working with families who had different ideas, all with the same goal, the same hope. But each approaching it differently. So that was difficult, and it was something I didn't expect, and I'm sure we were difficult as well. But coming into that, just meeting these families, these kids, it was just that was a remarkable experience. You know, about kind of shared kindred spirits. Nowhere is that more true, perhaps, than in the rare disease community.
Yeah. So Global Genes has been talking a lot about next-gen advocacy, and as you were, I came from the tech industry before, so I'll say that you were a true early adopter, but what we've seen that I think is extremely exciting, and you alluded to it a little bit earlier, is that in the last 15 years, advocacy has fundamentally changed, and this has been enabled by the fact that we can now diagnose patients more, precisely. We can, we have all of these therapies that are starting to be developed, and we have this technology around these precision therapies that could truly be transformational. And so, now what we're seeing is that advocates and patients are really jumping in, and, as evidenced by this community here and the number of, faces that we see here, and the number that are on the live stream, patients are really taking a much more active role in driving and kickstarting, work in their disorder. And so we're talking about reading a scientific paper, that you found, but you weren't a scientist, and, maybe talk a little bit about your background, and what are the lessons that you learned, as you were pivoting into science. About how to be, as successful as you could be.
You know, in that first year or two, and I was going out meeting doctors, go to conferences, researchers, I was there to meet people and gradually absorbing the science. And then finally, when we realized we were, running out of time, and I had this scientist in Oklahoma, and he wanted to start a small company, and he had 4 employees, $37,000 in seed capital, and based in Oklahoma City. The best he could do for a CEO was 31-year-old me at the time. And so I agreed to do that. And I think when you think about starting a company, right? I had a business degree, a law degree. I was in the Navy a bit, and I thought, I'll be that guy, and then they'll do the science, and I'll kind of pitch it to investors, and we'll have our division of labor. And you realize early on that does not work, and because I didn't know what they were talking about as I got into the company those first couple of weeks. And so I realized I needed to immerse myself in the science. They never wanted me in the labs because they were afraid I'd touch something. But what I did actually, because I was flying out to Oklahoma every early Monday morning, coming back on Friday for a year and a half, at night I hired graduate students at the university in biology and biochemistry and genetics. So there wasn't a lot to do back then in Oklahoma City at night, so I studied science. And well, you realize you don't have to be a scientist or a physician to run a biotech company, but you need to know your area, your therapeutic, your technology, as well as any PhD. Otherwise, you have no credibility. You can't translate those ideas into business plans, financing strategies. So for me, that's how I got deeper into it, because I had to.
Yeah, well, I often talk about the fact that rare disease advocates end up getting a PhD, in their disorder.
Oh, absolutely.
You have to just become the expert to be able to figure out how to create that plan, and that's what a CEO does, right?
And early on, people didn't want the advocate. I remember, going out to pitch investments for my first company. Everybody said, "Oh God, don't let them know that you've got 2 kids with the disease, because they'll never invest. They'll think you're biased." And so I took that advice, and it was like on slide 25, I'd show the logos of rare disease organizations, one of which was a small foundation my wife and I had started, and that's when I'd say, "Oh, and we started this because we have 2 kids." And that was a real issue in getting money into the company at first, and eventually they said, "Well, here's a CEO who will certainly be passionate, and we'll just put some guardrails around where they are, or where my focus may be." But one of the first things I did in that first company was to hire a director of patient advocacy in the summer of 2000. Pretty certain that was the first patient advocate in a company. I'm not quite sure I don't think the phrase existed before. And we built that out. And my VCs wondered, like, wait a second, you only have so much money. You're not even in animals, and you've got patient advocacy. And I described why it would make our program better and stronger by being partnered with patients and families from day one, to adopt that mindset in every decision you make, to think about it. If you had the disease, or you were the mom or dad of a child, what would you do? Where would you invest? There's this thought that, well, if you're a mom or a dad, you'll throw the kitchen sink at it, you'll be naive, and because you're desperate. And yeah, you may be desperate, but you're going to be smarter about it, because you can't afford to make mistakes. And the opportunity cost of going down a path where there is not going to be a good outcome is too much. So actually, this is why it's so critical, and that's why at Bio now, I've reorganized the entire organization. We set up 8 centers of excellence, one of which is patient advocacy. And Michelle Oshman, who's here, we elevated this within Bio. It's great for our organization. It's great as an example in the industry. But to be able to take the best practices of patient advocacy that's now in virtually every one of our companies, and many companies like at Amicus, having a C-suite level executive, a chief patient advocate reporting to the CEO, to bring that mindset, it not only gives you meaning and purpose to what you do, it makes these programs better, and it makes them move faster. It's essential.
Yeah, that's awesome. I want to talk a little bit about your bio and your 7 priorities, but I want to pick up on a thread that you brought up a little bit earlier, which was talking about collaboration. So you were talking about it from the biotech company perspective and bringing in patients. Thinking of it from the opposite standpoint. So at Global Genes, we talk a lot about building vibrant ecosystems and
Yes.
collaborative ecosystems, because that's really the only way that we can progress. And so it would be great to get your perspective on how advocates can engage different players in the ecosystem. And the ones that I'm thinking about, and you may have others, are academia, biotech, FDA / the regulatory bodies, and others. But it would be great if kind of you could talk about each of those in terms of how you would advise advocates to interact, and maybe we can start with academia.
It has to be, again, along that entire continuum. And we've got something really special that we've developed in the last number of decades. You have to remember, the biotech industry didn't exist until about 48 years ago. The first company was founded, Genentech, on early recombinant cell-based engineering. And when you look at the university research system we have, this is the true treasure in this country, this great academic system. But it never was designed initially to promote technologies moving from academia into industry, typically into startup companies. What changed was something called the Bayh-Dole Act. And it may seem like an arcane piece of law, but it's incredibly important, because before then, if universities received any federal funding, and most all of them did, the government could claim rights to any of the technologies coming out. So it was incredibly cumbersome. Anytime you wanted to license out a drug, a technology, an idea, you had to involve the federal government. The Bayh-Dole Act said, no, we will seed this research and development, and then we'll let market forces take over and private capital ultimately to develop this. And that led to this explosion of licensing and technology. So it's great science that we need to continue to fund. The NIH-funded research, it's part of the early part of what we are. So when we think about us, we as advocates, it's to make sure that that ecosystem is robust. And it's threatened today. People talk about these march-in rights and Bayh-Dole, and well, ultimately that drug doesn't get to this or that, or they made a mistake here. With this, whoever we may be, think that's too expensive, so we're gonna just take away that. You can't do that. The investors pull back, that you see less research in academia, and ultimately few of those technologies moving forward. So important in academia. New company formation is so important. The entrepreneurs, the vast majority of our biotech companies will struggle. Many will fail. And because what we do is really hard, right? You can raise hundreds of millions of dollars, build these incredible research, development, manufacturing facilities. You can hire brilliant scientists, researchers, but almost everything we try doesn't work. So it's a really high-risk investment. That model is really threatened right now. You've got on one end, you've got laws that are putting certain caps on whether it be pricing, and access is incredibly important. We need universal access, but there's ways to figure that out as well. So we need to encourage this system, because ultimately academic research plays an incredibly important foundational role. But medicines are developed in companies, many of them emerging companies. About 70% of all new medicines start in small startup emerging companies, and ultimately may rely on larger companies to, as we did. We didn't have the money, we didn't have the horsepower, the experience. I needed a bigger company in Genzyme to move our first drug forward. It would have failed otherwise. So all of that needs to come together, and that's where we need to be advocates along that entire continuum, because if one part of it fails, it doesn't work. And the last I'll comment on is the FDA. And again, the pendulum typically swings at FDA. I gave the example of HIV/AIDS, where they looked at every single molecule in that disease, that devastating HIV/AIDS, through that risk-benefit assessment, knowing what the risk was of particular molecules, but knowing what the risk to these people living with AIDS would be with nothing. That's the mindset that we need in rare diseases. We need safe and effective drugs. Regulators play an incredibly important role, but we need to make sure that they're empowered, that they're willing to take appropriate risks, that they're using novel science and technology. It's been a struggle for 10 or 15 years. It's been a real struggle. We lived it, I lived it, so many of us. You think about delay and denial just means suffering and death. And these are well-intentioned people at the FDA, but sometimes they're under-resourced, or they're too junior, or they're not getting the right direction, or they're getting the right direction from people who are great leaders at FDA. You think about the Janet Woodcocks, the Peter Marks of the world.
They get it. But now we need to make sure that that's taken throughout the FDA. And it is changing, this new rare disease innovation hub. In my job now, I have much more frequent and direct conversations with the commissioner and senior FDA leadership. I can be way more candid with where the regulatory system is failing us. And they're listening, and they're working. Peter and Patrizia Cavazzoni, I had a Zoom with over the summer. They let me know this new rare disease innovation hub that we've been working on with them, that their hope is that it would operate like a center of excellence. It'll accelerate medicines, it'll bring expertise. And I was cautiously optimistic there, and I'm increasingly optimistic. And if you indulge me for one sec, on Friday, I got 3 text messages from 3 different individuals in our community. One, a dad of a rare disease child who's also now a biotech entrepreneur. Out of the blue, I hadn't talked to him in a month or 2. Hey, John, sorry for the late text. Got some amazing feedback and guidance from FDA today. Would love to share it with you this weekend. And I got another text from an entrepreneur who lost a family member to a rare disease, and that was her inspiration in running a company. Hello, John. We today received the written minutes from our meeting with FDA, and I'm happy that the agency reflects now the encouraging and positive sentiment we experienced during our discussion last month. And the final one from a dad of a child with Niemann-Pick type C. I'm sure you saw this already. And it was just the FDA, a screenshot. FDA approves first treatment for Niemann-Pick disease type C. And now just a couple of days ago, the second approval. So I think we're turning the tide. We just need more of it. We need it throughout the agency. We need to empower the agency and partner with the agency. We need to be at the table for every discussion. We used to at Amicus, I had a rule: you could not go to the FDA for any meeting unless you brought a patient or a parent with you.
Well, Carrie Jo Lee from the FDA is going to be here with us at the afternoon plenary, so it'll be great to hear more there. I think one of the themes that I just heard from you across all of those different stakeholders and in the ecosystem is we are trying to do something very innovative and path-breaking, versus the way that medicines have been developed in in common disease, and in other areas, especially as we get into these more and more rare diseases. And so we have to be innovators. And I'll just put in a little plug. After our keynote, I am hosting one of the panel sessions, which is on running a foundation like a startup. So.
Yeah, no, again, we've got the mindset, we've got the passion. Frankly, I'd start to put metrics to it. To say, okay, here are all the rare diseases. Let's set a goal. Whatever it is, 10, 20 years from now, half of them will be treated, half of them will be cured, all of them will be cured, whatever it is. And like we would in running a business, let's hold ourselves accountable. And where are we year by year? Are we meeting that goal? And bring to the table investors, entrepreneurs, big company developers, the FDA, the NIH. Let's really finally have that kind of Operation Warp Speed mentality and hold ourselves accountable. And if we're failing, ask why. And that's just on the innovation side. So on the access side, we also need to make sure that we're not just getting new medicines and treatments approved, but they're quickly getting to everybody. And so, look, we increasingly see some pretty unconscionable practices by some insurance companies. Again, the delay and denial. We need universal access. If it's if it's a practice of a business, a biotech company that's preventing access, let me know, and we'll make this a discussion in our industry group. Why are people not getting your medicines? If it's a problem in the insurance industry, why is that? I've got this maybe crazy idea. Someone had, we did a lot as a community on 21st century cures. It was really important. Maybe the last bipartisan piece of healthcare legislation that President Obama signed into law. Bipartisan, Republican, Democrat. Somebody came to me with the idea that, okay, we're doing a lot on innovation, we need to do more, but we need to ensure universal access, so that nobody ever goes a day without the medicines they need. And too often in the rare disease community, they do. So what if we had a 21st Century Access Act? And we look at out-of-pocket payments for medicines, and some of the co-pays, co-insurance deductibles for these rare disease medicines are out of reach for people. So why are there copays for rare disease medicines? You know, copays are there so you have skin in the game and you're not overly using a medicine. Who in the world has a rare disease and says, well, hey, I think I'm going to go ahead and try that rare disease medicine? No, of course not. So let's not make it a barrier. Let's figure out all the economics in the system and who needs to contribute. And I've got this crazy dream. Maybe there are no out-of-pocket costs for rare disease medicines. And we figure out ways to absorb that.
Well, let's hope that that's not a crazy idea soon. So.
Well, we'll take it up, and we need to, again, we had 900 advocates that Every Life and Global Genes and NORD and everybody brought together last year on Rare Disease Day. Maybe not next year, but soon. Why don't we have 9,000 rare disease advocates and come to Capitol Hill, and they'll pay attention to that. The Orphan Drug Act, when it was struggling, if those of you who know the history, came to the forefront because, and this really dates me, a TV show called Quincy back in the 1980s. Some of you may remember it. Jack Klugman. Well, Jack had a brother, Maurice Klugman, who had a rare blood disorder. And when Abby and folks were struggling getting that approved, Maurice read the article, told his brother Jack about it, and they did a story, and it's a medical pathology kind of mystery, murder mystery show in the early 80s. And they talked about rare diseases, and they used it, and they had hearings, and Jack Klugman testified, and it wasn't going anywhere. So they did an episode the next season on rare diseases and the pending Orphan Drug Act. You talk about art imitating real life. And there's a scene at the end of that episode where the actor Jack Klugman is in the office of a fictional senator, and he gives this impassioned speech on why we need an Orphan Drug Act. And he opens the curtains in the senator's office, and he says, Senator, if this is not passed, you don't have to answer to me. These are the people you need. What do you say? These are the people you need to answer to. And they superimposed graphically thousands of people on the mall marching toward Capitol Hill. And this kind of curmudgeon senator looked down and said, well, he said, Doctor, I can't support your bill, but I won't stand in its way. And there were real life hearings then a couple of weeks later. And about 2 months later, in January of 1984, Ronald Reagan signed the bill into law, bipartisan. And he wrote, and he said in the Oval Office ceremony, he said, I only wish that with the stroke of this pen that we could also decree that the suffering of people with rare diseases would end. It didn't end with his signature, but it began this great market-based system of something really unique where we've flourished and we've done great work. We need to do so much more. So all of us coming, not just Capitol Hill, but in the States, and going out and showcasing science that's terrific, or science or businesses that are struggling, people who don't have access, whatever reason, if it's the fault of a biotech company, an entrepreneur, an insurance company, highlight that and let's fix it.
Well, now is the time, right? And well, so let's look forward. The biotech industry has been having, some challenges. It's been a challenging economic environment kind of across the board. And yet it's a time when I personally have had so much excitement. I mean, you mentioned Niemann-Pick, right? But there's many other rare disorders that have recently gotten approvals.
Yes.
And, sickle cell, first genetic therapy. So what excites you in rare disease now and makes you optimistic about what we're going to be able to do?
Yeah, I mean, it is, and again, to end on maybe a note of optimism and hope, the science out there is just amazing. When I sit down with our entrepreneurs who are members of Bio, and they describe for me their ideas, their technologies. You look at the gene therapies, when our kids were diagnosed, I called the doc, and he said, don't worry, this is 1998. We've got a gene therapy, and I asked him, of course, well, how soon till it's in patients? He said, a year, maybe 2. Well, here we are 20 some odd years later. But we're finally at that inflection point where we're seeing approved drugs in gene therapy and gene editing, where we can have much more meaningful cures and treatments. We're seeing platform technologies where they're not only working for one rare disease, particularly in the neurologic disorders, there's the potential to extend that technology, that medicine, to multiple diseases. We need to figure out a clinical paradigm and an FDA review paradigm for that. We also need to make sure we pass the Orphan Cures Act so we don't have that massive disincentive in the IRA where you're really heavily disincentivized to develop other indications for particular medicines. But those are some of the barriers. There's nothing in the laws of nature that says that we can't cure every one of these diseases, only in the choices we make as people. Yeah. And so let's break down those barriers. But the science is incredibly exciting. So that's where I get kind of jazzed up about this.
Yeah, I agree that we're really at such a pivotal time from a therapeutic development standpoint. And so, and just as my last question, what is the most important thing that you think that advocates and the attendees today can do to achieve this vision so that rare disease patients can, lead the lives that they desire and, make the progress that's needed?
Well, I think things like this to be conveners, and that's the unique role that families, caregivers, patients can play. When we talk about that virtuous circle, all the parts that have to come together, and how incredibly difficult it is to make newer and better medicines. But again, it's with the patient family at the center of that circle, not just because they're the purpose for what we're doing, with the work that we're doing, but because they're going to be the ones who drive that circle and to bring people together. So to realize that there's no one person, no one entity, no one part of that circle that's going to make that medicine. It's all of it together. And that's where, really this has to be an entirely patient-led revolution.
Thank you so much, John.
That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.